Hello and welcome to the Internet of Things Made Simple. I'm Larry Humor. This is episode number 17. Thanks for joining us. As always, shout out to our new listeners. Thanks for joining. Check out our webpage, theinternetofThingsMadeSimple.com, which has some phenomenal material on IoT. And I kindly ask you subscribe to this podcast using your favorite podcast service. In our main segment, we're going to look at smart medicine, which is how the combination of IoT, AI, and big data are changing how we practice medicine today and how they will in the future. We're going to cover things ranging from how it changes our visits to the doctor's office, our experience in the hospital, how it's going to affect many different roles in the field of medicine, and how it will lead to better health and more personalized healthcare. To start, though, we're going to cover the 10 Commandments. No, you don't have to frantically think of them, and you don't have to try to cheat by looking at Google. I'm talking about AI's 10 Commandments. A little while ago, the New York Times hosted an event called the New Work Summit, and they went over different aspects of the future work environment. And of course, it's pretty hard not to. The topic of automation came up. While at the conference, attendees put together a list of 10 things, or rules, or commandments, I guess, that AI needs to follow to make sure that it does more good than bad. The first is transparency. Companies need to be transparent about the design and the intention and how they implement AI. It seems that most companies don't do this with just about any technology. You know, they have a bunch of guys come in, it looks like some kind of a SWAT team, they lock themselves in a room, everyone just frantically talks over the water cooler, what's going on. That's not productive because it does two things. One, it creates anxiety, which is really dumb in a company. But more importantly, it excludes one of your most powerful resources, your team. So why would you want to do that? Two is disclosure. And this is for the users, although I guess it could be for the team as well. The company needs to disclose what data is being collected and, equally important, how that data is being used. And it needs to be on the front and center, not on page 125 of some user agreement that no one except for maybe like Sheldon from the Big Bang Theory ever reads. It's got to be front and center for the average person. Very similar to disclosure is privacy, and users should be able to opt out of it. Although I was going to warn people, if you're not paying a fee up front or some kind of a recurring revenue model, then do you really expect that the company is not going to make money somehow? And a lot of it is advertising. I get that. But your data and you as a product is what drives the business. So there's kind of a balance here. But it doesn't mean they should just give away all of your data, though. So it kind of have to balance it out. Number 4 and 5 are kind of related. And this is diversity and bias. I mentioned in a previous podcast about how facial recognition systems fail to identify many visual minorities. They're pretty much only able to identify plain-looking white dudes. And that's not because they're biased in general. It's because they haven't been subjected or shown pictures of other races, nationalities, genders. They haven't seen these kind of things. So how can you expect the software to be able to recognize them? It kind of makes sense. We need to do a better job in putting in less personal opinions and more data-driven with a much more diverse data set. Number 6 is that most companies should have some kind of an ethics board or a chief ethics officer. I don't really have much to say here, other than if you're going to have an ethics board, it needs to have customers and possibly employees on that board and to have an equal say. 7 is accountability, and it's that there should be a common standard for companies to be held to. I look at it as like any other kind of government regulation. I think the concept makes sense for many government regulations. You know, we want to have clean water and all these things. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. It's just if you make it too burdened and if you have different levels of government with similar regulations, that's when it gets into problems. And that's when you have a lot of issues of uncompetitiveness. And that kind of leads to the next couple points, which are collective governance and regulation. So let's just say we put in some rules that allow workers to be protected. So if their job is eliminated, there's mandatory training, and perhaps the employee has to pay whatever employment insurance goes into the government fund. They have to pay that for, say, 3 to 5 years to keep up the workforce and all the protections for the workers. Great. But if nobody else does that, so if another state or country doesn't do that, then all you're doing is making yourself uncompetitive. So who would ever bother to start a business that involves technology of any kind in your jurisdiction? So it kind of has to go across borders as much as possible. And that's where it's difficult because, let's face it, trying to get 180 or 200 countries, whatever might be involved in the industrialized world, to agree on anything is pretty difficult. The last one is most interesting to me, and it's the one that might or might not have the most controversy. It depends on where you come at it. And that's that AI should be complementary. AI shouldn't replace a human, but instead should be a very good tool for them. We're going to talk about this after the break, how it's going to do that in the world of medicine. If you think about how technology will work, I think companies might start off doing that. But I fear that many companies, once they see the power of AI, are going to start to eliminate jobs. And remember, automation or any kind of advancement doesn't have to eliminate jobs. Look at bank tellers. The natural thinking is that, once ATMs or bank machines went in, the number of tellers must have declined. And that's not true. The number of tellers went up. It didn't go up a lot, but it did go up over the next 20 years. And that's because businesses like banks are smart enough to realize that there's a lot of talent there. And maybe we don't have them as a cash dispensing machine anymore, but maybe our team can now focus on sales and referring leads to wealth management, those kind of scenarios. And because they did that, bank tellers became more productive. I think if we use that as an example, then AI will be very productive. When we come back from the break, we're going to look at how AI, IoT, and big data are making the field of medicine much smarter. Back in a few seconds. And welcome back. In previous podcasts, I've spoken about how using IoT can help keep you healthy, which is a great place to start. Knowing more about biometric readings, the kind of calories you're putting into your mouth, and other variables will help to encourage you to be healthier and will give you more information to bring to the doctor with you for your visits. In this podcast, we're going to focus more on how IoT and AI are helping to improve your medical outcomes when you see the doctor, but more from what the doctor and their staff are doing. The first area is diagnostic imaging, or X-rays or pictures, whatever you want to call it. And more importantly, it's being able to read the images more effectively. I remember when I first went to an ultrasound appointment with my wife, we were expecting our first child. I actually couldn't tell what I was seeing. To me, it looked like a Doppler radar or some kind of a weird thing. It just kind of reminded me of that episode of Friends, if you've ever seen it, where they're trying to point out to Rachel where her baby is, and she gets all upset saying, "I can't see it! I can't see it!" That was pretty much me. I didn't see the baby for the first few times. I just didn't want to admit it either. Fortunately, the image tech in that case, and for most of them, have no issue, and they can see what's going on, and they're great at what they do. In many cases, though, AI can make them better. The first example is in cardiovascular images, where automation has shown to have a better rate at detecting issues, namely because it can delve down to a pixel and other levels that the human eye just can't pick up all that well. This helps in a few ways. It helps, obviously, to detect things that possibly weren't seen. It can also result in faster decision-making and in fewer errors and in fewer false positives. The same is true for scans of bones when detecting for fractures. Again, I don't think that a tech and or a doctor is going to miss an obvious fracture, but AI is just a little better when it comes to seeing fractures and even possibly some tissue injuries around there. It also allows doctors to focus on more important things during a trauma. So imagine, if you ever watch those shows like ER and other ones and it's all hectic, they often have to wait for the x-ray and while they're trying to do other things. If you have some kind of an automated system that automatically took the x-ray or the image, that allows the doctor, the nurse, and other people in the trauma room to do other things, which could help to save some lives. In a similar way, the brain can be very difficult to diagnose using images. Diseases like ALS are often difficult to diagnose, so AI is helping to improve the accuracy. And as important as it is to find a case of ALS, it's equally important to be accurate when it comes to giving false positives, because that's not really an ailment I think most people would want to be incorrectly diagnosed with. The same goes for issues in the chest, namely ones like pneumonia, which can also be difficult to diagnose under certain conditions. AI is able to use a few things, namely algorithms that can say, whenever I've seen this pattern, 94% of the time it's been pneumonia, whereas a doctor might not have that ability to act like a Sheldon from Big Bang Theory, to quote him again. Finally, different forms of cancer can also be difficult to diagnose using scans, and this often results in procedures that aren't necessary, like biopsies and other invasive procedures. It's especially true when it comes to breast and colorectal cancer. The next one was fascinating to me, and it has to do with communication. Many conditions are so brutal that they take away the patient's ability to speak as well as to communicate in other ways, and this is very common in many neurological disorders. A brain-computer interface sounds like something out of a science fiction novel. It allows for doctors and their patients to communicate using neural activities that are associated with hand movements. So if a person couldn't make a certain hand movement, perhaps they can pick up a sign in the brain that shows the person was trying to make this movement. And this allows the patient who cannot speak to have a voice. And I found that to be really cool. AI can also power what is called the virtual biopsy, which allows a doctor and a surgeon to get a better understanding of a tumor before they go in and have a much better plan of attack. This allows for a much higher rate of cures and removing it all. I've spoken in a few podcasts about how 5G offers enough bandwidth and, more importantly, much lower latency than any network we've ever seen before. It has the horsepower to power many remote applications, including remote surgery. This was shown, I don't think it was a true case, but it was shown at the most recent Mobile World Congress. I think 5G's potential to further increase performance will truly make this a possibility, not just in my lifetime, but over the next couple of years, I think. This allows for a few things. One, much better treatment for rural patients, especially those perhaps in the third world who may not have access to certain specialists. It also allows for trips to be avoided if the patient is unstable and maybe perhaps can't get into a helicopter. It's going to help to save lives that way as well. On to the record side of the shop. When you watch some of these shows on TV, I don't care if it's a cop show or a show about nurses, doctors, lawyers, they always take the really sexy and cool parts of the job and they show that to death. You know, when you watch like Law and Order, it always seems like, wow, that's the coolest job. And then you find out the officer goes back and does 4 hours worth of paperwork for all the stuff they just did in the last 20 minutes. It's not quite as exciting. The same goes for medical. Yeah, if you're a doctor, there can be some real exciting cases, especially in places like the ER. But you don't see them going off in the back and offering up that great handwriting skill that doctors are known for and making notes. And that's a really big time-consuming part for them. I don't know if most of us understand how big charting is. They started to help out with this by moving towards electronic health records. And that didn't necessarily help reduce the amount of clerical work. It just made it easier to find records and to have them transported among hospitals and among doctors. AI is going one step further. So imagine you had this 6-hour surgery where the surgeon did, 4 or 5 different things involved. They now have to recollect or have somebody that took notes, make all these big notes as to what was done. Imagine if they could just film the surgery and AI can detect, oh, he's doing this with whatever body part this is, and he did this procedure. And at the end of the surgery, the surgeon just looks it over and goes, yep, exactly what I did. I'll sign that. That would free them up to do so much more. Now imagine that for nurses who are looking after patients who may have 6 or 8 different things to do while they're in the room and they have to chart them all. Same idea. Imagine if they just got back to the desk and it said, did you do the following things for Mr. or Mrs. Jones? Yes. Go ahead. It now makes for much more accurate records, less handwriting errors. I think it's a great step forward. And when you factor in that it could even go beyond that, and it can measure incisions for, again, a surgery for much more accuracy. It can include accurate readings of biometrics, which are now automated. This makes things safer and much more productive. Once you have all this data, though, it's a matter of what do you do with it to make it worthwhile. And that's where the big data side of the house. So just a reminder, you've got IoT, which gathers all the bits and bytes data. You've got AI that can allow that data to be put into action and decisions. And then you have big data that shows trends and other things along that lines. Big data, as I started to talk about, plays a big role in healthcare. If you ask Google who's sick in what areas, they kind of know. If you're Googling sniffling and cough and what temperature does a child have a fever at, they're recording that. And they know that if 10 people in your block or 1,000 people in your neighborhood or 10,000 people in your city are all Googling these things at the same time, there's a good chance there's some kind of a cold or flu epidemic. They can go one step further and now look at it by symptoms and even look at things like measles and stuff like that as well. So if you think about it, Now, how does that work for hospitals? Can they start to see different patterns? So can they see, for instance, that people in a certain area are now starting to have a certain kind of infection, and that might indicate there's something wrong with some pollutants in the air? It's also starting to track how certain medications are working. So it can see that when they had this flu or this treatments that were required, these antibiotics worked at a 75% success rate, or these ones worked at a 90%. And they can also factor in even added details like how do they work for 68-year-old men versus 12-year-old girls. This is where big data really comes into play. When we come back from the break, we're going to look at how it's improving the ability to customize medicine and to improve your stay in wards like the ICU. Back in a few seconds. Okay, welcome back. IoT might be relatively new in the area of medicine, but the idea of gathering information from people using sensors and leads is not new. This has been done for a long time, whether it's a test being done in the doctor's office, but the example I'm looking at here is all the leads and all the things that are worn for people in sections like the ICU. This helps the nurses and the doctors to see what's going on. You just have to watch an episode of Grey's Anatomy to know how important these things are. And by the way, I'm only in season 6 of this show. I'm watching it on Netflix. Does every patient in the ICU and the OR always crash? Is it just me, or do they seem like the worst doctors sometimes until these things crash and all of a sudden they become the best? Anyways, just me. I'm just thinking about that. So these leads are great at alerting the doctor and nurse, as I mentioned, or a family member of an issue with a patient in any ward. But they're especially important in a place like the ICU, where people tend to be their most sick. But again, no one's watching these. They're only told if the variable happens to go above or below a certain range. AI goes one step further than that. It can monitor the pattern of hundreds, thousands, even millions of people in these kind of wards, and it can notice whenever this certain kind of heart rate pattern happened, sepsis was 80% more likely. Or on the opposite, when this kind of pattern happened, people were more likely to make a speedy recovery. And this would allow information that perhaps wasn't being noticed because, again, nurses especially and doctors are quite busy. They don't sit there and watch these monitors all the time. The next point is everyone's different, at least in the case of medicine anyways. Our bodies may often act very similar as an overall group, but some of us have individual allergies and other issues to deal with. Take a horrible disease like cancer. Why do some people fare better to certain treatments than others is still a bit of a mystery in many cases. One of the biggest advancements that medicine might see from AI might be the ability to customize medicine. One of these cases is what's referred to as immunotherapy, where doctors use the body's own immune system to attack cancer tumors, often resulting in better outcomes for many patients. However, as I was mentioning, we're not all the same, so the ideal setup can be difficult to find, and this might mean that we're not getting as much success as we could have. AI is able to crunch a huge amount of numbers along with big data. This allows us to get a better understanding not only of the human body in general, but to be able to customize the approach much better for each patient. The next one I was going to talk about is kind of interesting because it involves an IoT device, your smartwatch. I've spoken many times about how insurance companies are lowering down their rate for life and medical insurance if you agree to use a Fitbit. This is very similar to putting one of those trackers in your car for auto insurance. If they can know more about you, they can better accurately know your risk of certain ailments. On a larger scale, though, just imagine how much data is sent to Fitbit. How do they make sense of it? It's staggering. Multi-millions of devices are every hour are putting in heart rates and blood pressure if they have them on, and EKG on some of the Apple Watches. That's a huge amount of information. What big data is doing, and along with AI and other intelligence, is better predicting patterns, such as, as I mentioned before with the ICU, if a certain pattern is happening on a Fitbit, is the person much more likely to be having a heart attack or about to have a heart attack, and they can send a warning to the person. The other interesting area that involves a common electronic device is the smartphone. As phones get better, they get faster. Usually the cameras follow along. Now the resolution on a camera is just staggering. Researchers are starting to capture data from billions of selfies that have been taken and starting to be able to identify different disorders from pictures. For now, it's mostly in the area of dermatology, and I'm going to try to pronounce this, ophthalmology, your eyes, but it's starting to push into different areas. And we could see it being able to diagnose up to 500 diseases over the next few years. This is kind of helpful if you live in downtown Los Angeles or Seattle. This is very helpful, though, if you live in some of the developing world countries. Because amazingly, the percentage of smartphones is pretty high, but the percentage of doctors is not. If we're able to diagnose remotely using camera pictures, that's an interesting area of technology for me. The next area has to do with medication, and not so much the reminder part, which I have spoken about. Obviously, there's different applications that can remind you to take medication. There's different pill bottle monitorings that can tell you if mom, dad, or grandma took her pills. That's not what I'm talking about here. Those are important, but that's not what I'm talking about here. One of the biggest issues with medication is the amount of time it takes to get to market. And don't get me wrong, I'm not against trials. I like the fact that they're not just guessing like, we'll see what happens. Take this. Who knows? I'm glad they're putting it through trials. I'm glad there's some very heavy testing in most areas of the world. But it does slow down new things getting to market. The other thing it does is that when you have to test on people, you bring the element of risk into it. And yes, people are paid. They know the risk, but AI is starting to be a little smarter. AI is helping, along with big data, is helping us learn more about the body. And as we do, it's not inconceivable in our lifetime that we'll never have to test on a human. And that allows us to bring things to market faster and safer, which is great. And it also reduces the amount of error and the ability to customize medication for certain people. The last 2 points have to do with customize, which is a great segue. Just like how I mentioned you can eliminate some drug trials, it also has the ability to do the same thing when it comes to estimating what could happen to a certain treatment option for a person by running so many different scenarios that are much more accurate than ever before. This allows the person to say, you know what, based on these 4 million scenarios we have gone through, it's about a 60% chance that this medication will solve the problem, and the surgery option is an 88% chance. Again, not perfect because there's a lot of variables there, but that's something we don't have today. We don't have that ability to estimate things based on the person. It's all based on historical accuracy, where in the past, someone of your age bracket and health is roughly this. We can now give information much more for you specifically. Treating people is wonderful, but it's much better if we can prevent things before they even happen. I've always believed that, and I think it makes sense. If you look at what AI is doing now, when you combine it with IoT and big data, it's giving unique chances to learn more about human DNA, and more important, about your DNA in particular. This allows us to analyze genetics better than ever before, better predicting long-term health issues well in advance. There are diseases now where you can check for a marker or an indicator, but this will give you much more information, much more likelihood and timelines. Also, if we know more about your genetics, and in genetics in general, and your DNA, as I mentioned before about the idea of predictive maintenance and guessing outcomes, that just gets way more accurate. When we come back from a short break, we're going to look at some potential issues that a mass introduction of AI can bring to the healthcare system. Back in a few seconds. And welcome back. Thanks for sticking with us. I don't think many people can complain with some of the advantages that I've spoken about for the last little while. It's great, personalized medicine, shorter trials. These things are all perfect, it sounds, right? Well, they kind of are, but AI is not without its faults. And there's a lot of them. I'm just going to cover a few of them here. The first one that jumped out to me is privacy. Much of the value of these whole systems is the ability to analyze huge amounts of data. I don't mean just the records of 3 or 4 people. I'm talking about the records of 1 billion people. That's how we learn much more about rare diseases. That's how we get much better medicine. But think about it for a second. All this data has to be put into one or a few places. Who hosts this data? I have no idea. What, is there some big kind of Academy Awards? And the winner is, I won! I own the world! Who protects this data? Who owns this data? So if all of a sudden this company goes, I'm going to take over the world and sell everyone's healthcare information, and then who makes sure that it's only aggregated data ever used? I've spoken with this kind of data before. Imagine you going for a run through a park and you run 3 miles that day. Fitbit knows that, and it will take all the different people who ran through that park and provide the information to a city. But again, they don't know it's you that ran through the park. They just know that somebody ran through the park. Are they going to do the same? How do we ensure that they just say that 48-year-old males have this kind of condition 94% of the time? How do they know they're not going to share my name, for instance? The next issue is interoperability, which I'm amazed I can say that because I didn't stumble that out. Is there going to be a common data record for all records? Very similar to what we have for a computer system. So, the Windows operating system or iOS or Android. Is that where we're going to go towards? And if so, what system? Again, is there a big Academy Awards here? How do we make sure the systems work together? How do we make sure they're interoperable? Is someone going to set up some kind of an agency like it happens in the computer space? How about the fact that there could be hundreds, thousands, millions of different people or places, organizations uploading and downloading records at the same time? How do we do that? How do we make sure that everyone's got all the information? Do we allow different information to be seen by different organizations? So does a hospital see something different than a researcher? How about a drug company? How about a rural doctor? Can they all access the same files? The next issue assumes that we're moving more towards automated medicine, not so much helping the doctors, but potentially are we getting rid of doctors and nurses altogether? This kind of reminds me of the show that I do enjoy, The Good Doctor. If you're not familiar with the show, the main character, who's very well played, is a surgical resident who has autism. He has an incredible mind. He's able to see things that even 20-year surgeons can't see, and they're amazed at how he's able to visualize different anatomy and different flows of the body. However, he's definitely lacking in one area, and that's the ability to communicate with patients, which has led to some of the more awkward moments during his conversations. I'm just wondering, how are they going to make AI any better than Sean from The Good Doctor? How are they going to be able to approach things to know when the patient might want it sugar-coated versus said bluntly? That's something I don't think they're going to solve for a long time, which would be a major limitation to getting rid of the human touch. In short, I think we need to look at AI, just like we spoke about in the first segment, as a tool to improve healthcare, not to eliminate any roles. Most of us still rate bedside manner and communication as being very important when it comes to healthcare professionals. So there's no replacing a doctor or a nurse or any kind of an aide anytime soon. I do see, though, that AI is going to be great for medicine. I'm all in. I'm 100% behind this. As I mentioned, it's going to improve diagnostics. You're going to see much better treatment plans. You're going to see treatments coming to market better. And you're going to see much more effective treatments offered by doctors, allowing them to do their job. And all at the same time, it should reduce cost in clerical work and overburdened systems, which is great for everyone. It doesn't matter if you're in a public or a private system. This is a good step forward. We just have to make sure we're doing our due diligence here. And maybe those 10 commandments I spoke about in the beginning, maybe they are a good thing to start. Well, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I do enjoy talking to you. As always, drop me a note, good, bad, or even ugly. You can start with our Facebook page, The Internet of Things Made Simple, where we have some great material there as some podcasts and some blogs and some other ebooks. You can find some good links there. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn if we're connected, or if we're personally connected, drop me an email or a text. Don't call me anymore. I barely answer the phone. Thanks again for listening. I'm Larry Humor. Take care.